Good good morning, everyone. My name is Krishna Adhikari. I am the convener and today's moderator of Nepal Dialogue UK monthly webinar series. Today's episode is 19th. Center for Nepal History UK has started this Nepal Dialogue series in 2025. And the team that is behind putting this event together includes Lokendra Dhakal, who is the Executive Director of Center for Nepalese UK, Naresh Khapangi Magar, who is co-convener of the webinar, Dr. Sangita Srestha Swecha, who is a media coordinator, and Dr. Susma Basnet, also member of the team. We run a public talk followed by a panel discussion on the subject of contemporary interest on Nepal or Nepali diaspora. Today, we're going to have a talk. Before I introduce you to the talk and the speaker, let me remind you that we will be running this session for about 1 hour and 15 minutes. There might be some flexibility towards the end. We ask all our participants to stay muted at all times, but there will be plenty of opportunity to write your questions and comments through chat box once the lecture presentation has ended. With this, I would like to introduce today's topic and also the speaker. Gen Z revolt of September 2025 marked a defining turning point in Nepal's modern political history. There are some unanswered theories and speculation, but there is no denial that it was sparked by accumulated anger and frustration over corruption, economic stagnation, and controversial social media ban. Thousands of young people took to the streets demanding accountability and systematic reform. The protest forced the regime change, along with the dissolution of parliament and formation of an interim government to hold general elections. The momentum generated by the uprising carried into the 5th March 2026 general election, where voters overwhelmingly rejected the traditional political establishment and handed a historic mandate to the Rashtriya Swatantra Party under Balendra Saha, who is also known as Balen. Nepal has one of the youngest prime ministers in the world, youth-led cabinet and parliament, facing the difficult task of translating the aspirations of the Gen Z movement into lasting democratic and developmental outcomes amid high public expectations. Gen Zs are showing political awareness globally. Nepal has been at the center and in a sense been seen as an example and source of inspiration for many others around the globe. Today, we have Professor Jeevan Sharma, who has closely researched into the subject to deliver a talk on promises and perils of youth-led movement, insights from Gen Z uprising in Nepal. Professor Jeevan Sharma is a personal chair of South Asia and International Development at the University of Edinburgh. Prior to his appointment in Edinburgh in 2011, he taught at Prof University in Boston. He is the author of Crossing the Border into Nepal to India, Youth Migration and Masculinities in Nepal. That's published from Temple University Press 2018 and reissued in 2024. The Political Economy of Social Change and Development, issued through Bloomsbury in 2021. At present, he's working on his forthcoming book, manuscript, Nepal's Gen Z Revolt. He also holds appointments as a visiting professor at the School of Arts at Kathmandu University, and he's a senior visiting fellow at International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, in Kathmandu. Jeevanji was in Nepal when the Gen Z uprising took place, and he was very close to the epicenter of the Gen Z protest events in Kathmandu. And as a result, he is also among one of the first academics to very deeply study the subject and also to write a book. So we are fortunate enough to have Jeevan to present part of his work that is going into the manuscript and tell us his perspectives on the Gen Z revolt. Jeevan, next 30 minutes or so is yours for presentation. Then we will enter into the more informal type of the Q&A. Over to you.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Is that visible? Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, I
that's
can.
great. Thank you, Krishnaji, and thank you to CNS UK team for putting this together, and for all of you to for coming to engage in the discussion and not just listen to me, because I know the topic is very dear to all of you. So what I'm going to talk about, as Krishnaji has already mentioned, is a part of a book, actually a work in progress in some ways, the concluding part of the book, which is basically sort of largely focuses on the ambiguous nature of this uprising, right? So I have titled this for today's talk, Promises and Perils of Youth-Led Political Movements, Insights from Nepal's 2025 Gen Z Uprising. Okay. As Krishnaji mentioned, I was in Nepal during this uprising. So part of what I'm going to talk about sort of, has sort of or emanates from my experience being in Nepal, but also from my long-term observations, particularly since 2005. Right. So to this audience, I don't think I need to really give you much background on the Gen Z Uprising, but I want to kind of draw your attention to these 5 specificities or 5 specific features of the Gen Z Uprising of Nepal that I think is relevant to my talk. I'm not suggesting that, the key features of the Gen Z Uprising are only limited to these 5. But I want to kind of draw our attention to these 5 features or 5 specificities of Nepal's Gen Z uprising. First, it started as a protest initially at a digital campaign articulating a generational experience of corruption, flexing of wealth. I'm using the Gen Z language flexing as it was used during the digital campaign as well as in the street protest, and inheritance of privilege often being displayed by the families, the children of the economic and political elite in social media like Facebook, Instagram, etc. And linking both of these to precarious futures of Nepal's youth, often articulated or evidenced in the digital campaign as well as in the street protest as queuing of young men leaving Nepal for overseas employment as migrant workers, right? So what is really important here is to really highlight this aspect of generational experience that was shared by Gen Z, and I'm not suggesting that this experience was limited to people belonging to so-called Gen Z age group. Could have been also shared by middle-aged women, for instance, who had similar sort of nonetheless a generational experience of these. And what is really important is the connection that the protest and the campaign made between corruption, lack of accountability, the flexing of wealth, and the kind of pessimistic future, pessimistic economic futures for Nepal's youth. Second point that I think all of you are aware of, but is nonetheless very important to point out, that it emerged outside of institutional politics. So this did not emerge from within an oppositional sort of political party. It emerged outside of institutional politics, outside of well-established social movements even, through what we could call a digitally networked youth activism, drawing on a long history of youth-led social and political action. In another chapter of my book, I kind of locate this in the last 15 years of history of youth-led social and political action, including youth participation in anti-corruption activities, humanitarian work post Nepal earthquake of 2015, or the flooding, post-flooding sort of relief work, or the kind of crisis emerged out of the COVID pandemic, and various forms of social action focusing on the rights of women, bonded laborers, and many other sort of marginalized sort of groups, right? And this is very different. This is very particular, that the September 2025 Gen Z Uprising has roots in these discrete forms of youth-led social and political action that have been sort of, simmering in Nepal. And this was not just activism in the sense, it's also kind of, humanitarian work, development work, heritage, preservation work, culture preservation work, where young people have been involved in. Nonetheless, it also drew from the sort of the witnessing of various forms of Gen Z uprisings in other parts of the world, particularly in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh in the previous years, in 2022 in Sri Lanka, 2024 in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh was very much discussed and debated in Nepal, right? For example, famously, Prachanda, made a statement, but also in social and other online media, would Nepal see a similar sort of uprising like Bangladesh was very much sort of tabled in Nepal's public sphere. Nonetheless, I think the point I'm trying to make is it emerged from outside of institutional politics, that is outside of political parties, outside of established social movements, but also did draw on, sort of global symbolism of Nepo kids. That's the kind of, the label that's been used. And the very name Gen Z is very much drawn from the global political movement, right? The third point I want to kind of, underline is the revolutionary uprising that we saw in the streets with over, 30, 40,000 people in Kathmandu alone. And let's remember that this was not limited to Kathmandu. So, the street protest was taking place simultaneously in other parts of Nepal as well. It settled with Nepal Army facilitated, in Army's word, negotiated settlement, right? So in some ways it ended in a kind of, sort of temporary sense, a negotiated settlement involving, again, using the Army's sort of word, stakeholders, right? So it was not a movement that where the revolutionary activist or youth activist, went ahead and established a new regime. It was very much tamed or managed through Nepal Army. And that's really, really important for us to kind of, for those of us who have been watching this uprising and the, what has been happening post-uprising through the interim government or through the new government. Army remains an important player. So I guess what I'm suggesting over here is the uprising, the revolution that was seen in the streets did not necessarily end with a revolutionary sort of government in that sense, right? That's the third point. The fourth point is, as Krishnaji mentioned in the introduction, we've seen a generational shift in Nepal's parliament. Nepal has, one of the youngest, sort of parliamentarians in Nepal's sort of history, with average age, I think, is around. I can't remember. I think if I have, I'm sure people in the audience, on the top of my head, and also a cabinet. I think the cabinet is average age is 38 or something. Of course, it's changing with with some speculation that we may be seeing new faces, etc. But nonetheless, the point is, we've seen a generational shift in Nepal's parliament and in the cabinet, right? Not necessarily in Nepali state or satta in that sense. So the fifth one is the sort of vision that the new government seem to have embodied is of a technocratic agenda of accountability and reform rather than a radical reimagination of Nepal's economic and political futures, right? And that last point is really important, and I think directly relates to what I'm going to talk about, what I have in the title, is this sort of sense of course, it is a developing story. March was, the 5th of March is when the election took place. End of March is when the new government was put in place. It's only had its honeymoon period of 100 days just yesterday or day before. So it's too early to kind of, make it, it's quite risky to make an assessment. But nonetheless, based on the sort of, evidence that we have, I'm kind of arguing that it's put forward a technocratic agenda of accountability and reform within what I call neoliberal sort of framework, rather than what one would have hoped of from a revolutionary sort of movement, if it was a radical imagination of Nepal's economic and political futures, right? So I guess what I've done just now is to sort of slightly moderate the revolutionary potential of Nepal's Gen Z uprising, but nonetheless recognizing that it remains, perhaps it does have some potential as well. Okay, sorry. Right. So these are the sort of questions that I'm kind of particularly interested in. How do we make sense of this uprising that we saw in Nepal? How do we characterize it? Is it a revolution? A purpose. In purpose, I've used present tense is rather than was, because it depends on whether we want to kind of take that moment as a revolutionary moment or what has happened since then as a part of the same sort of process. Is this a revolution or a revolt or simply a protest led by young people seeking political reform and accountability, right? How does the uprising mark a great transformation in Nepal's political history? As highlighted in my previous slide, it does to an extent, but it does not. If we depending on how do we approach this, right? Okay, so since this is a public talk, I don't really need to get into the sort of the scholarly debates on political uprising and revolutions. Just to give you a sense of where Nepal stands in the broader sort of context or the broader debates, scholarly debates on political uprising and revolutionary movements. The scholarship is largely divided between treating an uprising either as a social kind of movement or with a social character or with a political character, right? So regime change versus, thinking about political freedom, liberties in American revolutionary sense versus the social kind of as it was in the French revolutionary sort of sense. The debates are also between structure and agency. That is, Nepal had perfect sort of structural features, right, for a Gen Z-like uprising. Youth buzz with large number of young people, unemployment, corruption, lack of accountability, 3 men sort of, engaged in musical chairs and, historical inequalities, et cetera, right? So there are structurally, Nepal seems quite conducive in that sense. But that does not really explain, why did we see something like this in Nepal and not, say, for example, in India, for example, which also shares, or Pakistan shares similar structural context. And that has been debated, right? So often the scholarship is kind of divided between these. So likewise, people often sort of distinguish between whether it's a violent movement or a non-violent. And violent uprising largely in the context of rural sort of insurgency and movements and so on, particularly since 2010, as we saw in Arab uprising and since then in various forms of youth-led political movements. The movements have been in urban areas in the form of civil kind of, protest and, largely on, kind of non-violent and in urban areas. The debate is also between revolution as a movement. That is, is it a revolution when you see a large number of people in the street, capable of overthrowing a regime or, forcing a prime minister or the head of government to resign? Or should we think about revolution as an outcome, right? If it is an outcome, how long do we need to wait for that outcome? How do we empirically sort of make sense of that? Is it an event, in other words, or a process, right? So do we just judge whether Nepal's uprising as an event, the event of 8th, 9th, or the week after that, or should we take, what is happening now, 9, 10 months from then, or even in the next few years? So how do we, sort of make sense of a revolution? What is the threshold? What is the sort of timeline that we should capture, right? And scholarship also talks about success and failure, right? Whether the movement, how do we judge what is successful and what is not successful? In Nepali, the idea that, oh, well, jo aaye pani tyastai ho, jun jogi aaye pani kaanai chireko, right? So is it like, then how do we make sense of the generational shift? How do we make sense of the kind of large number of young people and people from other generations in the streets? How do we make sense of some of the impressive signals that the new government has put forward in restructuring Nepal's future? I'll come to that, right? And also the scholarship is also divided between sort of looking at the domestic internal factors and international factors. That is, of course, as we know, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, and so on, there is always sort of a speculation in the context of current geopolitical volatility of international factors being extremely important. So this is how the scholarship. So I think what is really interesting about Nepal is this sort of dichotomy does not make any sense. We had violence, we had street protest, peaceful street protest, turned into a violent sort of uprising. We did have structural conditions, but there are also activists who were very important in shaping the process. The movement seems to be also about sort of ending the regime led by KP Oli, but also radical in some ways, at least some kind of future, at least discursively of thinking about jobs or thinking about economy and thinking about futures for young people and so on. So basically what I'm saying is the way scholarship is divided, we can't, Nepal case does not necessarily fit in either or of these dichotomy. So Nepal case is very important to try and push the scholarly debate on political uprising as well. Okay, very quickly. So thinking about, I've used the words promises and perils. So I believe I will do justice to these two terms. As Krishnaji mentioned in the introduction, Gen Z uprising marks, in my reading, a significant rupture in Nepal's political history. We've not seen in Nepal's history youth-led political movement like what we saw in September 2025. The only other sort of youth-led political movement, and here what I mean by youth-led political, I'm trying to kind of distinguish between youth-led political movement and political movements where young people take part. Of course, we have a long history of student unions and youth wings of political parties being very instrumental in previous political uprising and so on. The one is Jayatu Sanskritam, sort of the movement during the Rana regime, and the other one is during the referendum of 1980, the Janmat Sangra, where young people kind of led the movement, right? Otherwise, we've not really seen a youth-led political movement of this nature, of this scale in Nepal's political history. It was unarmed, mass, civil-based uprising, which forced the sitting prime minister to resign and flee in army's helicopter, as we know. The uprising did not end in the streets and squares. It did not end in Baneswar or in Maitikar or in various squares in throughout Nepal, but in the political power as the old political parties were pushed out at that moment when the interim government was formed, but also in the electoral sort of outcome of March 2026, right? Also involving dissolution of the parliament, which is very much sort of occupied by the established political parties. Gen Z activists, particularly in day 2 on the night of the 9th of September, demonstrated what I would argue, excellent sort of creativity to protect potential counter-revolution in the sense of hijacking of the movement by the Nepal Army. We know about, activists coming out of the meeting with the Nepal Army in the Nepal Army headquarters, publicly talking about how our chief of Nepal Army had suggested that they engage in conversation with stakeholders whom they did not necessarily see as stakeholders. And that was a moment, I think, defining moment that, in my reading, prevented and shifted the sort of the potential counter-revolution that we possibly would have seen. So what we have is a new generation in charge of the parliament and the government, right? So these are sort of some of the promises that we can sort of see in terms of some statistics might be useful here. So most parliamentarians in the lower house of parliament currently in Nepal are between the ages of 28 and 42. 54% are under 40. Only 5% are above 70. The median age dropped from 58 to 39. So that's a significant sort of shift. And this is real in the sense, generational shift is real when you look at the age of those who have been elected. Our prime minister is 36. The youngest minister is 29. The oldest is 51. Which is something we've not necessarily seen in Nepal. Not the youngest prime minister in Nepal's political history, but youngest in recent past. And the government has necessary political power because of its near to 2/3 majority. Short by 2 votes, but including the speaker, short by 3 votes, I guess. But it also has. Beyond the sort of the number in the parliament, it also has the support of Nepal Army. Nepal Army has been behind this particular government, starting from the negotiation that took place in day 2 of the uprising. The new government claims to view, institutional politics, that is, led by RSP, sort of joining politics as service, right? At least discursively, rather than a career, in the sense that as a way to sort of try and discredit the old political parties who were, kind of criticized for being self-centered in accumulation of private wealth, etc., that we are different, right? So that's the sort of, we are here to serve. That's the sort of the idea. We are here to deliver services, provide good governance. We are not here to build our own career, for generations, etc. At least discursively, who knows? There is a strong dislike in the discourse. Discourses used by the government for clientelism, patronage. That is a fundamental part of Nepali sort of life. It would be impossible, in my view, to imagine Nepali society without clientelism and patronage and afno manche, because that's how people live, right? And it has put forward, in some ways, I would argue that they sound very, nice and great, but I think these are problematic propositions and problematic ideas put forward by the new government with the ideas of meritocracy, efficiency, governance, and development, right? These are some of the, 4 key sort of mantras that the new government has, it appears, has put forward. The idea of meritocracy, that everything will be done on qualifications and merit, we've seen in the kind of appointment of VCs, including in a ridiculous sort of way appointment of I would say diplomats as well, to say that, well, we are going to use meritocracy and invite people to apply for diplomatic positions is something I think we'll have to wait and see what that actually means. And the idea of efficiency, that the bureaucracy has been inefficient. We want to kind of downsize it in a very neoliberal sort of sense. Yeah, our focus is on governance services, but services to whom? Questions of historical inequalities, caste, class, gender, ethnicity, religion, everything is kind of not necessarily talked about in this vision of governance and development. But nonetheless, these seem like, sort of, in some ways, a particular sort of, ideas that the government has put forward. So what are some of the risks or perils? And they do emanate, this is where it's ambiguous, emanate from some of the sort of promises. So it's not a sort of clear-cut sort of categories between, so like these are the promises and these are the kind of the risks. They are very much linked, and I think that is why we need to be kind of vigilant, I guess, both in the civic sphere, but also intellectuals and others. So the role of Nepal Army has been debated very much, and Army has been complicit during and after the uprising. During the resignation of KP Oli, who one could argue was forced to resign by the Nepal Army in some ways, but also the role of Nepal Army during that sort of the political interregnum. At the very moment of political negotiation, when the chief of army was the one who came in front of our screen and spoke and gave a quick statement, and not the president. President appeared after the next day, after so much of hue and cry in Nepal's public sphere, saying, "What is the president?" Right. So Nepal Army remains a very important player, and I'll talk about where Nepal Army has also been visible in the recent past. The style of governance appears to be very much driven. We know this from during the election, how Balendra Shah joined RSP at the end of December, quite late, right? Largely because of his popularity. So the new government seemed to be very much sort of, populist, and has shown, one could argue, some form of authoritarian tendencies, as we know, during the removal of squatters in Kathmandu and other parts of Nepal, where the middle classes seemed obviously complicit, that they want to see so-called beautiful Kathmandu with parks and so on, would probably like to see people come and do work in their house, clean dishes, etc., who probably often lived in, or drive taxis and work in cafes and restaurants and whatnot and other jobs, but not want to see them live in those places. We also saw that sort of authoritarian tendency in the arrest of Krishna Hari Puskar, a secretary in the office of our deputy president, right? Vice president. We saw in the recent kind of fiasco involving passport, the printing of passport, involving forcing CIAA, which is a constitutional authority, forcing them to make arrest warrant, and including arrest of the Director General of the Passport Department, but also many other officials. There is a tendency of concentration of power under the Prime Minister, relying on his secretaries, not bureaucrats, but his personal secretaries. I can expand on that later. I know that I'm mindful of time. And a new government has sort of relied on ordinance, right? Rule by ordinance. It's a majority government, but it has sort of relied on this sort of, a number of audiences would put forward in a very strategic way in the name of efficiency, because everybody wants to see a result, etc. which is sort of directly sort of undermines the kind of the authority of the parliament, right? And it goes alongside the undermining the constitutional values, the parliament and the presidential office. We've seen, how the prime minister, for instance, has not, made an effort to meet the president in the last few months, in the last 100 days, but also he walked out of the parliament when the president was reading policies and programs of the government. And there are many examples of that, right? And the government, was complicit in the appointment of the Chief Justice, because it said in the statement of the government spokesperson talked about, well, it was done in merit, looking at how many cases, for example, the judges had at the Supreme Court, out of the 4 who had shortlisted, had offered. And apparently it seems that whoever was appointed is not necessarily, even by their own standard, does not meet that merit criteria. But nonetheless, we know, for those of us who have followed Nepali politics, that the government did not want the number one in line to be the Chief Justice, was seen as someone who's aligned to one of the political parties. And there is this sort of the fallacy of meritocracy, as I talked about just now, and the kind of the idea of digital promise that everything is going to be now based on merit and efficiency using digital technologies, and it's going to improve services, right? So this sort of reliance and on the promise of the digital to do everything for us. And this is going hand in hand with the downsizing of bureaucracy. Nepal's bureaucracy has been criticized, rightly so, for lack of efficiency and so on, in terms of cultivating patronage. There is a sort of program of a legislation currently under discussion for compulsory redundancy of civil servants, those under the age of 55 and those who have served 30 years. So this is a way to kind of, radically sort of reorganize Nepal's bureaucracy. And many people, I think are in support of that. Other people are sort of, concerned that is this, well, after all, this government came out of a popular uprising. You could argue that it is taking some, but whether this counts as a revolutionary step or not is something I would love to discuss with you all in the next half in the discussion. And what I think is also problematic is excessive dependence of this government. If you look at the policies and plans as well as the budget, reliance on private sector-led economic growth, and no emphasis, or I would say no emphasis or less emphasis on distributive justice, poverty inequalities, job creation. None of these things feature in the economic policies. The finance minister even went on to say, well, to distribute, first of all, we have to have something on the pot. And he's gone into kind of, borrowing, a large amount of money from international financial institutions to push for this private sector-led economic growth. Kind of, this does sound very familiar to many of us who know the experience of other parts of the world, where, this is how neoliberal policies work. Like, well, there is a bit of a difficult sort of, time for next few years, but after that, everything is going to be great. Really? Not sure, We have to wait and see. Of course, it's just been 100 days, but nonetheless, I'm willing to make that point. So in conclusion, I think what I want to sort of talk about is, make few points that I see what happened in Nepal as a revolt rather than a revolution. It was a rupture. It was a revolt. It does have a revolutionary potential. I do not want to sort of, limit the revolutionary potential just because the government, as I outlined, has all those sort of, concerns and sort of, risks that I outlined in the previous slide. But I see this very much as a revolt. It was a Gen Z-led revolt, very much, almost hijacked by counter-revolutionary force, as I indicated previously. But also, I think, RSP, one could argue that, yes, there is a generational shift, but, RSP emerged, it's not Gen Z activists who are in the ruling seat today. It's RSP, which is not necessarily a completely new force that came out of revolution, right? It was established in 2022 as an alternative political party. They are the ones who appear to have, taken advantage of this particular situation by inviting and incorporating many of the youth-led political forces, youth-led political movements like Viveksil and individuals as well. There is a systematic undermining of the revolutionary potential by undermining, in my view, the idea of liberty, ideas of equality, idea of, a constitution, parliament, and so on. What kind of a revolution are we, waiting to see? Is something to be, we have to wait and see what is coming. And the key argument that I've offered here is that the focus appears to be very much within the neoliberal framework of reform, development, and this is a word that was used by the prime minister, the finance minister, and other ministers, the powerful, the chairman of RSP, rather than a revolutionary imagination based on some form of intellectual radical political ideology, right? I think that's gone, right? So that's not really there. So I think what we have settled with, a reform and development, which is not necessarily new because we were there, since mid 1980s. All Nepal has been talking about during the term of Mahat, Ramsaran Mahat. All he talked about was reform, right? And development has been the key sort of organizing principle in this period. No clear vision on job creation, no social protection, to protect from precarities. Growth before distribution is symptomatic of deepening neoliberal policies. And I think there are ambiguities on the use of so-called liberal values to undermine democracy, parliamentary democracy, parliamentary system, and constitutionalism. With all political parties discredited, any dissent, the only form of dissent that is likely to kind of emanate would be from within the ruling government, as well as the Gen Z activists. Several Gen Z activists we know of who have been outside of the ruling government. Okay, with that I conclude here.
Thank you, Jeevanji. Such a very good summary, I think, of the big topic you are trying to tackle and write a whole book about. I'm sure that many of the books also would be warranted. And there are many, things are developing, and, we'll see how things unfold. Thank you for this. And I would like to encourage our participants, please feel free to put your comments or questions in the chat box. We already have a few presented here. In your presentation, you have rightly, captured a lot of ideas and things. I think any of the points could be explored in detail. But I think rather than just simply putting my own questions, let me start with the questions here in the chat box. So I hope you are also able to read them, Jeevanji.
Yeah.
The first one is by Pooja Aryal. She has pointed out that the Western scholarly definition of concepts such as revolt and revolution or social change, they are not maybe enough to develop a framework of our own that emerged from Nepal's own historical and lived experience. Given the thinking and political consciousness of Nepali people have been shaped by factors such as unequal access to information in remote areas, intergenerational experiences, and everyday realities, struggles of the communities. Shouldn't these contexts inform how we define and understand? Maybe these are some of the the points raised here are very much shared globally as well, but I think I'll let you address that, Jeevanji.
Yeah, thank you. I hope others are also able to read that question. Thank you, Pooja ji, for that question. I think you're absolutely right that we don't need to be limited by Western sort of frameworks and definitions. And I think that is precisely what the Gen Z Uprising of 2025 has shown. that this is different, right? So obviously, it is not like the French or the American or the Iranian and other revolutions. There is no sort of political ideology, driving it. Absolutely. Um, but if we think of this, as completely sort of, not all revolutions need to fit the sort of the Western sort of scholarly frameworks and so on. Absolutely. But at the same time, I think, then how do we judge it, right? So how do we judge a movement to be a revolutionary or not? And and I think that's the real question. Do we judge it in terms of, is it sufficient to see, change of the guard as a revolution? Effectively, what we've seen in Nepal is change of government, really, right? Um, Alongside that, of course, there is a generational shift, and there are sort of various forms of reforms that's been put forward. But I don't think that, for example, to see Nepal army being kind of, playing quite an important role during the uprising and afterwards. And Nepal army represents one of the conservative forces in Nepal's political history. How is it that it's okay to see the old political parties to be replaced by new, but Nepal army remains as it is, right? So what about the reform, say within one of the most sort of clientelist and conservative force? So I don't. So the fact is, the point I'm trying to make over here is, unless and until we see a revolutionary change in what we call satta, Rajya satta, in the sense of the political. I don't think we are going to see. I mean, I'm going to call it a revolution in that sense. And there are concerns on civil liberty, for example, the way the current government is working. Civil liberty ought to be, at least in my view, a fundamental sort of principle or idea driving any form of revolution.
Okay, thank you. I think the link to that one, Sanjay Sharma, in first part of his question, very detailed as always. I was wondering how are the conspiracy theories featuring in your book, involvement in the king and right wing, right? Okay, now it's down. Okay. Oh, sorry. Second part. He says that how do you see the claims by intellectuals that Nepali intellectuals do not have the right tools to understand and theorize the Gen Z movement and departure that Berlin government has taken? I mean, this is very much linked to the previous one about our own context, our Matosong, if you like,
Yeah.
system previously like. They cannot we think of the different framework and very differently.
Yeah.
So I
No,
think
I
that,
think. Yeah. Many, obviously, some intellectuals have said that, right? So the answer to your question is there, in the sense that some intellectuals are saying intellectuals are not able to. So of course there are different views and opinions. Yeah, meaning I think, as I have outlined as well, there has been a shift. No one can deny that there has been a shift. There has been a rupture. But to call it a departure is not a revolution. Just because there is a shift does not mean that it is a revolution, right? Um, say a coup, for instance, an army-led or a political party-led or monarchy-led a coup does not qualify necessarily as a revolution in that sense. So I think we need to really sort of take into account of, yes, I would not deny, and I'm very much in support of empirically. I've seen it. And I'm writing in my book alongside this that yes, there has been a significant shift, and I think we have to acknowledge that. But I'm not prepared to see this as a revolution in that sense. But you're right. Yes, conspiracy theories. I think what I'm writing. Yes, I am writing about various conspiracy theories. Well,
you
whether they
mean
are
Sanjay Sharma's first point about
first point. Yeah,
how do you feature the conspiracy theories? Okay.
yeah,
Before coming to that one, I think because during your presentation you have highlighted that this sort of revolution, revolt, whatever we call it, not seen before, but this has happened in the more neoliberal settings. Maybe this is going to be a kind of a new feature of the revolts than the very the ones people used to imagine and think in the past. That looks like no outside the box of the institutions. Looks like a apolitical. Maybe that's very much developmental than the ideologically led. Maybe can there something be said, or have you thought about this in the new settings that what is going to be, because a new digital world previously people couldn't imagine. A lot of things. As you were in Nepal, I was also in Nepal. That came as a very surprise, both during the Andolan, and also even in the elections, the established party were, when we contacted them, they were not thinking then what was, coming on the way. They storm.
Yep.
Can
No,
we?
absolutely. Meaning, I think when I mentioned ideology, I mentioned sort of, the political and the sort of intellectual ideology that historically have driven, other sort of revolutionary movements. You're absolutely right. Movement, whether they call it or not, there is as I outlined, there is a sort of ideological sort of, underpinnings driving this particular uprising, and I've called it a sort of, a neoliberal sort of idea of reform. That is what is driving, right? Although not explicitly articulated by the drivers, what we see being articulated, at least in the first 100 days of the new government, but also we know these people who are in the governing sort of, ruling government, the political party. I think it's fair to say that it's very much driven by the sort of ideas of, neoliberal ideas of reform, accountability, rights, and efficiency, and the sort of the promise of the digital, and that is the ideology. That is the ideology. But can that be revolutionary in the sense if it undermines some basic principles of revolution? If we were to borrow that from intellectual discussions, is that revolutionary or not? It's
Mm.
something to
Yeah.
discuss. But I completely disagree. So it's very much neoliberal. It undermines, as I outlined, some basic principles of freedom and a vision for a radical transformation of the political and the social. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure you have written this in the book, but to remind our audience that the government led by Sushila Karki also, in a de jure sense of the word, recognized this as a third Jana Andolan. If I think just to provide kind of there was lacking some kind of legitimacy in a sense, if you wanted,
Mm-hmm.
it was a revolution or not. Anyway, moving to the next, I think this conspiracy theories and the role of army, you have discussed enough there. I remember that David and I collaborated with a researcher from Madagascar to discuss about Genji movements. The Madagascar Genji movement that followed Nepal's, they actually brandish, use Nepal's flag as a source of inspirations there. The role of army and the history in Madagascar is very different. I think in Madagascar, army aligns with the groups. Bosch also is somehow also takes as a demonstrated as if he's a kind of the adjudicator or the neutral force,
Mm-hmm.
and is holding things into his own power for 2 years and to have election. Nepal was very suspicious of some kind of complicit involvement, as you said, but it was swift. So that's the difference there. Uh, and the army, this is very maybe just speculation. Maybe you know better. I don't know. Did army have some kind of the pre-ideas, or was the pre-coordinator? What's the to understand the conspiracy theories better, or to have more theories there? What is your take on it? And before and maybe you can also address Sanjay's questions that how you actually featuring these old theories into your book.
Yeah, I'm featuring them as it has been discussed. I have no first-hand. I was not present. In those closed door meetings. With the army. So the kind of insights I have, but I did interview some army, top army officials about this. Obviously, to be used. Nothing surprising, but obviously, in a much more clearer sort of sense of the justification used. So my sense is that army, the situation would not have turned out to be as it has if army had not acted the way it did um, in day one of the street protest, day two of the protest, including what you could, what I would call it, non-cooperation, or not providing assurance to the prime minister, for instance, and really suggesting that the prime minister must resign, like many people, including myself, I think, had articulated that at the time. So army was very important to shape the by not agreeing to get to go into the streets or to get mobilized the way it did. For example, it was not the president; it was the chief of army who came out and gave a short, sort of speech. The army got mobilized at that time. It was the army who called the Gen Z activist, as I talked about in my presentation, for a talk in the army headquarters, and even suggested that they talk with other stakeholders with whom the Gen Z, at least two Gen Z activists walked out and spoke to the media. And I think that changed, in my view, that shifted the dynamics. Army, the interviews that I did with Army, Army used more or less the similar sort of justification, saying, look, Army cannot get mobilized on its own. And it takes time to get mobilized. Just because KP Oli resigned at 1:30 whatever time does not mean that army can quickly get mobilized throughout Nepal. It needed time, so that's why the time of 10 o'clock or whatever, but it does not at the same time explain many questions that I outlined. But we also know from other sources and other sort of interviewees, including former politicians who were present with the president or in conversation with the Nepal's president. Nepal's president, until the evening of the night of the 9th, 9th September, army was very much, we know army has been in charge, but army had total control, and things could have, if the Gen Z activists who went to the army headquarters had begun to engage with the stakeholders, as the army chief put it, I think things would have been different for sure. And that I can say based on my interviews with the activists who were there, but also with the army that I interviewed. Things could have been different.
All right, thank you. In the interest of time, I think this suffice for now. This issue about the army also was raised by Ashish ji on the chat box here, so you have addressed. But there is also conspiracy idea about the foreign hand, especially the Youth Council, U.S. Youth Council often comes into play. At least in the conspiracy theories. Of course, this is a very difficult subject and there are no concrete evidence perhaps, but what's your take on it?
I have no take in the sense that, how, it's difficult. What I've done is I have pointed the sort of, I have located the emergence of the Gen Z uprising to the youth-led social and political action in the last decade and a half. And many of the youth activists have benefited from some of the, activities that you've mentioned, but also many others. But to kind of, I think that this question can be answered in two different ways, right? Obviously, the scholars of international relations, in the era of geopolitical volatility, they have sort of talked about how, Gen Z sort of uprising linked with, regime change through the use of the manipulation of the digital and, various things. And I'm not a scholar of international relations, and I'm, without evidence, I'm not really prepared to talk about it. But, so I have no really sort of, direct evidence to link this to some form of, I think it completely undermines the generational experience that I talked about in my, young people are not just out there to be manipulated by, youth council and others, the kind of activism and the kind of socio-political action that young people have been engaged in, starting with the activism of Ujjwal Thapa. And remember say 2009, 2010, the sort of that moment of the political optimism that Nepal had seen after the peace process started, and the sort of the election for the Constitutional Assembly, the kind of not being able to write the Constitution on time, and the sort of frustration with contentious politics and Nepal Bandh, frequent Nepal Bandh and so on. And I was in Nepal that time. I was living in Nepal, 16 to 18 hours of power cut, right? So this was a moment of kind of, a critical moment where young people experienced the political in a very different way, right, than the previous generation. So I would not buy into, of course, there may be, who knows inside the closed doors, who is thinking of what, but I'm not prepared to sort of link it to a, simple link between, this wanted, that wanted. Even to make the argument in the army, I've used the sort of evidence to say, well, what did army do and not do? And, we have that hard evidence, so, but to link it to some form of foreign conspiracy is to completely undermine the movement, which I'm not prepared to do. I think you're on mute, Krishnaji.
Thank you. Thank you for this. Before we move on to the, current government and how, it's doing, it's still on the part of the, perils, if you like, you have, on your title of presentation. I was thinking about the violence that happened on the second day, and here Biswa Adarsa Pandit also has uh, put a question to the very last year. How do you distinguish the Bhadra 23 uprising from the violence took place on the 24? Also, was the rebel backed by army? Anyway, let's leave the army point here because in the interest of time. Of course, there's the important point here is that what does the role of the army, police, and conservative force of criminal process. I think I would be interested to know what is this government going to do? I mean, for us, many people, it was a huge incidents, and that followed on the second day as well. First day, there was a big loss of the people, but the second day, Nepal's, the violent past of Nepal, if you like, the Maoist, movement and others, there were certain things that hadn't been done. And
Yep.
we saw that in burning of Singha Darbar, the burning of the national symbol and so on. And I think it won't be erased from the mind of the many people.
Yep.
So what is going to happen? I mean, can you address this Biswaji's question? This very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, my own reading, I think, which I'm sure nothing surprising is, the movement of the second day. The second day movement started, in different parts of Nepal, particularly, I know of Kathmandu, in Baneswar, people started coming out in the street as early as 7 o'clock. And these were relatives, friends, who had come to mourn, to demonstrate at that point of time. But of course, what we saw later in the day is of a completely different scale, which many analysts have talked about, sort of coordinated sort of attacks. Evidence has been sort of, presented in media by several, credible media houses on coordinated nature of these sort of, various attacks that we've seen. But, it was to be expected that there would be some form of, sort of movement on the next day by people, the Gen Z activists, but also their families and friends, and people were angry, right? To see within 3 hours so many people being shot dead and so many people being injured. It was not a small sort of moment in Nepal's political history. I'm not denying that there was no, sort of coordinated sort of attacks. There was, it seems, based on the evidence that we have. So day two was a mix of both. There was definitely, I can say based on my own sort of observation, living within, 5 minutes from the Baneshwar Square and, 3 minutes from the Civil Service Hospital, there was a natural kind of, people just coming out, spontaneously. But what we saw later on was it seems based on the evidence we have, coordinated. I think what was more concerning was there was no resistance to it, right? By the state forces, they had retreated. The army had refused to get mobilized while the political negotiations were going on, or to put pressure on the Oli government. While the situation overnight, it seems various elements, have decided to take an advantage of the situation, decided to, go and attack, simultaneous attacks on, and you can see the timeline, in my book, I do have a sort of, a detailed timeline. There is also a timeline presented by, in the Karki Commission report, which is not officially public, but is public, which also has a sort of timeline with sort of verification of CCTV footage and everything. We can see that. So definitely there was an element, but I'm not prepared to say that this was by design, the whole thing was by design in advance, but there could have been some design overnight after the what we saw on the first night. Overnight, it seems there was some planning, otherwise getting explosives and having, evidence from Discord to say that, going to these places would not have been possible without that.
Yeah, the point about now, I think more interesting, but people will be interested, at least I am, is that the we have seen the government now is very active on certain things, in terms of its commitment, if you like, to change, the culture of corruption and so on. But are we seeing any particular action targeted on that day
There is
two?
there is an investigation, right? So the government has ordered, and there is I can't remember the name of the chief who is another, I think it's Karki again, I think is the name of the person, who is, kind of because the recommendation was to do a thorough, we have, basically we have, if you think about these investigations, we have several we have NHRC investigation, which is a separate one. It's a constitutional body. Nepal, Human Rights Commission has its own investigation on both days. And NHRC report also has quite much more detailed information on day two than, say, Gauri Bahadur Karki Commission report, which has a little bit on day two, but has largely sort of recommended that this should be investigated separately. And we have various investigations done by media houses and, credible, media houses on both of the days as well. So we don't know what the government is going to do at the moment, but we know that the investigation is going on, and if whether that becomes a big point for the new government or not is not clear. I don't know.
Right. Okay. Right. In the interest of time, I'm just trying to maybe pull together a few questions here. Naya Sharma Paudel is asking that how do you evaluate the critique that movement, the RSP party and the Berlin government all lack any concrete political ideology, comprehensive program? Does it mean that it will be short-lived? Is there a prospect of its transformation in the long run? I mean, that's itself as a big question of its own. But I think I would like you to juxtapose this to the point raised by Diksha Phuyal. Many youths have raised questions of RSP being liberals and neoliberals that took advantage of Gen Z uprising, and it is quite ironic consideration. It is started to hold powerful people accountable and focus on equitable development that prioritizes the underprivileged ones. How do we judge the current government, and what can we as citizens do so that the current government practices constitutional values? And other point, I would like you to think together so that you can give a slightly long answer if you like. It's a Jiva Acharya. Do you speculate young generation of Nepal will strictly observe, monitor, and alert to the public and politicians who are governing? What do you think about the future of the old politicians as well as the parties? Do the public will support them? I think these are various points about for and against of the government doing. I mean, in one short phrase, I just wanted to ask also a point about is the current political scenario in Nepal ageist against the people who is older and they're useless. So what's going to happen in Gen Z regime, if you like.
Yeah.
If you could address
Okay.
them,
Yeah.
in
Okay.
a wholesome
Yeah.
way.
Very briefly, I think I think I'll try and sort of answer, but these are big questions, the first two in particular. But Krishnji, starting with your question, I don't think they're against. We've seen, yes, the parliament and the cabinet is full of younger generation, but I wouldn't call them sort of against the. We've seen various appointments where people of certain ages are appointed. The VC, for example, of the Tribhuvan University appointed as of yesterday is not a Gen Z. Obviously it's not it's not as clear cut as that, right? So I don't think we need to really worry about the generational commitment in that sense. But I think the other questions on the ideology, I think this government does have ideology. It's not that it doesn't have ideology. And I think we have to go back to better understand RSP as a movement. Um, it had its first sort of general convention just about 2 weeks ago, I think, in Chitwan, and it's trying to emerge as a political force, but its ideology is very different, in the sense different to that of say Nepali Congress or the Communist Party of Nepal or the UML, or RPP. In terms of I think they are trying to kind of clarify their political sort of ideology. Constitutional socialism to social democracy was once mentioned. But I'm not interested in what they write, etc., in their constitution. I think based on what we know of what it's a very short time to kind of I don't want to pass any sort of judgment in 100 days of this particular government, as the party itself is trying to form and the government is trying to put forward some kind of program. It's very neoliberal in my reading, because the language of reform, language of Bikas, development, language of efficiency, the language of the digital sort of promise, and the language of downsizing of the state, kind of bureaucracy, it all very much resonates, and I would argue draws on the neoliberal idea. So that's the government. This is a neoliberal government. Has even gone ahead and taking a huge, looking at the budget, the amount of loan, no mention of distributive justice in terms of distribution. The finance minister himself said, first accumulation, then distribution. Anyway, so that's my sort of, I think what we can do, I think, or what public can do, I think, on this is, I think there would be resistance to the new government, both from within the party. I think the kind of evidence we are seeing, some sort of friction within the ruling government, between different individuals, different ministries, between the Prime Minister's office and the others. But also, I think the credible voice at the moment in Nepal, I think, remains in the civic sphere, the Gen Z activist. The names, that we saw, the Gen Z, the organizers of the Gen Z street protest, many of them did not join institutional politics. They remain in the public sphere, and their voices remain quite critical. At least, if we see, some of them have joined, the new political party, or the old political party even. But many of them remain, and they remain the sort of, I think, the core voices who are going to, kind of account for, ask for accountability from the streets. And I think and all political parties are currently discredited. We know. Yeah, but we don't know how long will it take, because they are also, trying to sort out. There is a sort of within political parties, a sort of shift we saw between the Gen Z uprising and the election, and also realignment, I guess, currently going on. The Congress Party is still trying to sort out itself. We know that nothing is permanent, in Nepali political history, that, even if we look at the last, several decades. So, yeah, things will change, likely to change. But I think one particular sort of concern that people have is the sort of the tendency towards some form of, populist, technocratic sort of authoritarianism. The Prime Minister does not speak in the Parliament, does not speak to media, speaks through Facebook, right, on Fridays. and makes jokes, and the issue of the detention of the secretary that I mentioned, who had sent him a message. It's something unimaginable, I would say, in in any sort of democratic sort of polity in that sense. Does that really require an arrest of a sitting government secretary who had sent a message indicating that I'm retiring and I'm looking for a possible appointment afterwards? We don't know the exact content. Of course, things have surfaced in different ways in social media for sure. But I mean, yeah, that is concerning. And if that is to happen, are we, is it a part of a sort of a broader movement, something that we've seen in India or in other parts of the world? It's something to be seen. But I think Nepal's public sphere is at least so far quite vibrant. So we don't know, whether that is the direction this government is taking or not. But is one thing I can say, based on the action of the government in the first 100 days and some of the action of the party and the individuals who are involved in the government, this is definitely a neoliberal kind of government in the sense of reform, accountability, efficiency, digital promise, and the downsizing of the bureaucracy. Whether we believe, whether we think this is a good thing or not, it's entirely the choices of the voters and the public. But that's the direction it's going. That's the ideology it's taken.
Thank you, Jeevan for your comprehensive presentation, a very big subject which we all are also familiar in a sense, but giving some kind of academic frameworks and looking at from various angles to this one. In the interest of time, I just would like to mention that we have got a few comments, mostly agreeing what you said, and also looking forward to reading your book by Bhakta Gurungji, Pooja Aryal, and so on. I would like to thank you,
There is a
Jeevanji.
question by Kapil Shresthaji. If maybe time is over, but I think he's
All right,
raised
okay.
hand.
I mean, if you have seen that, I mean, I might have missed it. What is it? Okay.
I think he's raised hand, but I think he's
Oh
not
no,
typing.
we don't allow hand raising, unfortunately. We're just trying to be very strict on time, and so that it doesn't go so long and it start becoming. I'm sure it's not boring, but sometimes it happens. So we have put a kind of the system organized in a fixed time of a first Saturday of a month and organized this way. So far this is working. So my apology to Kapilji for this one. Next time you can write your question. Thank you, Jeevanji. First of all,
No, it's fine. No problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeevanji, for coming and giving this presentation and also leading this discussion on very important subject that is a matter of concern to all of us in Nepal and beyond Nepal. And more importantly, I would like to thank all our participants for joining us and engaging in the discussion. Our program takes place first Saturday of every month, 10 o'clock UK time, which corresponds to Nepal's 2:45 p.m. Until the clock changes in the UK. So until I think it's October sometime. And next month we haven't decided what to do, but it should be as per format a panel discussion. If you've got any important suggestion, if you like to be part of the process, you're very welcome. Please write to us. Thank you for joining and look forward to meeting you next month, and have a nice weekend, as we say in the UK. Have an enjoyable day. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishnaji. Thank you.
Yeah. So
Krishnaji, will those comments be available to me?